three armed thugs burst into a small-town diner, demanding protection money from two helpless elderly women who can barely afford to keep their business running. A quiet stranger sits alone in the corner booth, calmly finishing his apple pie, as the criminals threaten to redecorate the place. When the old man politely asks them to leave the ladies alone, the lead thug shoves him hard and laughs. But what these punks don't realize is that this soft-spoken stranger is Mike Tyson himself, the most feared fighter in boxing history and secret six-time world karate champion. The criminals have just made the worst mistake of their pathetic lives, picking a fight with a man who spent decades destroying opponents with devastating precision. While they're still mocking the old-timer, the legendary fighter calmly sets down his coffee cup, his eyes turning ice cold. The elderly women step back, sensing that violence is about to be unleashed in the most terrifying way possible. The thugs keep laughing, completely unaware they're about to face the most dangerous man on the planet. What happens when street punks attack the wrong senior citizen? Will these criminals survive learning why some legends never fade? What happened next would terrorize the lead thug for the rest of his miserable existence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered pickup truck hummed along the Tulane, Montana highway as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and crimson. Chuck Norris adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, feeling the familiar ache in his knuckles that came with 7 decades of life and countless hours of martial arts training. The radio played an old Merle Haggard tune, the kind of music that reminded him of simpler times when right and wrong weren't matters of political debate. He'd been driving for 3 hours since leaving the Veterans Cemetery outside Billings, where he'd placed fresh flowers on Tommy Rodriguez's grave. Another good soldier taken too soon. Another reminder that time was the one opponent none of them could defeat. The scenic route home had seemed like a good idea this morning, but now the fuel gauge needle hovered dangerously close to empty.as. He crested a small hill. A faded sign appeared in his headlights. Welcome to Millfield, population 847. The town that spread before him told a story he'd seen too many times across rural America. Boarded storefronts lined the main street like missing teeth in an old man's smile. Cracked sidewalks spoke of better days long past, and the few people visible on the streets moved with the hunched shoulders of defeat. Chuck's trained eye took in details others might miss. The way an elderly man quickly averted his gaze from a passing car. How a woman hurried her children along, glancing nervously over her shoulder. The general atmosphere of fear that hung over the place like smoke from a distant fire. In his years of military service and afterward, he'd learned to read the signs of a community under siege. The low fuel light blinked insistently on his dashboard, pulling him from his observations. A neon sign flickered ahead, Betty's Diner. Good food, good folks. Half the letters had burned out, but the promise of coffee and a hot meal appealed to him more than the sterile efficiency of a chain restaurant. He pulled into the gravel parking lot, noting the handful of other vehicles, mostly older trucks and sedans that had seen better decades. The diner itself was a classic 1950s structure, chrome and glass that had been maintained with obvious care despite its age. Through the large windows, he could see red vinyl booths and a checkerboard floor that probably hadn't changed since Eisenhower was president. Chuck turned off the engine and sat for a moment, stretching muscles that had carried him through more battles than most men saw in 10 lifetimes. The evening air carried the scent of frying onions and coffee, homey smells that reminded him of his childhood in Oklahoma. He stepped out of the truck, his worn cowboy boots crunching on gravel, and adjusted his flannel shirt. The town was quiet. Now, almost too quiet for a Friday evening. Street lamps were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows between the buildings. Chuck glanced once more at the peaceful scene, unaware that this small Montana town was about to become the stage for the kind of confrontation that had made him a legend. He walked toward Betty's Diner, the bell above the door waiting to announce the arrival of a man who would change everything. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully as Chuck stepped into Betty's Diner, immediately enveloped by the warm aroma of home cooking and fresh coffee. The interior was a perfectly preserved slice of Americana. Red vinyl booths worn smooth by decades of use. A black and white checkered floor that gleamed under fluorescent lights. and a vintage jukebox in the corner playing Patsy Cline softly. Only 3 other customers occupied the space. 2 weathered farmers in flannel shirts sharing quiet conversation over pie, and a long-haul trucker nursing a cup of coffee while studying a road atlas. The atmosphere was peaceful, almost timeless, exactly the kind of place Chuck had hoped to find. Evening, Han, sit anywhere you'd like. The voice belonged to a silver-haired woman approaching with a coffee pot and a warm smile. Donna May, according to her name tag, appeared to be in her late 60s with kind brown eyes that had seen their share of hardship. She moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd been waiting tables for decades. Much obliged, ma'am. Chuck settled into a corner booth that gave him a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen, old habits from his military days. This is a nice place you have here. Oh, it's not mine, dear. That would be Betty. Donna May gestured toward the kitchen where a sturdy woman with steel gray hair was visible through the service window. She's owned this place for over 20 years. Coffee, please. Chuck accepted the steaming cup gratefully. And I'll take a look at that menu when you have a moment. As Donna May poured his coffee, Chuck noticed her hands had a slight tremor. Her smile, while genuine, seemed forced, and her eyes kept darting toward the windows facing the street. The other customers displayed similar nervous energy. The farmers spoke in hushed tones, and the trucker kept glancing at his watch as if eager to be elsewhere. Betty Patterson emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a woman who'd clearly worked hard all her life, with calloused hands and the kind of solid build that came from lifting heavy pots and standing for long hours. Despite her fatigue, she approached Chuck's table with genuine hospitality. Welcome to Betty's, stranger. Don't get many new faces around here these days. Her voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd seen too much stress lately. What can we get you? Chuck studied the handwritten menu board. How about a burger, medium? Well, with fries. And a slice of that apple pie I saw in the case. Looks homemade. Everything here is homemade, Betty said with a flash of pride. I'll get that started for you. As she returned to the kitchen, Chuck sipped his coffee and observed his surroundings more carefully. The diner was impeccably clean and well-maintained, with small touches that spoke of genuine care, fresh flowers on each table, carefully polished chrome fixtures, and photographs of local history lining the walls. But beneath the surface warmth, tension crackled like static electricity before a storm. The 2 farmers finished their pie and left quietly, nodding respectfully to Betty as they passed. The trucker followed shortly after, leaving exact change and a generous tip. Chuck found himself alone with the 2 women, the silence broken only by the soft jazz playing from the jukebox and the sizzle of his burger on the grill. Donna May refilled his coffee without being asked, her movements automatic but distracted. You just passing through? She asked, attempting casual conversation. Yes, ma'am. Heading home to Texas. Chuck noticed how she relaxed slightly at his answer, as if his temporary presence was somehow safer than a permanent one. Betty returned with his meal, the burger perfectly cooked and the fries golden brown. As she set the plate down, her wedding ring caught the light, a simple gold band worn thin by decades of wear. Business been slow lately? Chuck asked gently, sensing an opportunity to learn more about the town's troubles. Betty's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Oh, you know how it is in small towns these days. Folks have to be careful with their money. The way she said careful suggested she meant something entirely different. Chuck was about to probe further when headlights swept across the diner's windows, casting harsh shadows across the walls. The sudden glare of headlights transformed the cozy diner into a harsh tableau of light and shadow. Chuck watched through the window as a black SUV and a beat-up sedan roared into the parking lot with unnecessary aggression, their engines revving loud enough to rattle the diner's windows. Music thumped from the vehicles with a bass line that seemed designed to intimidate rather than entertain. Donna May's coffee pot trembled in her hands, and Betty's face went pale as chalk. The transformation was immediate and telling. These weren't ordinary customers arriving for a late dinner. Chuck set down his burger and shifted slightly in his seat, his body automatically adjusting to a position that would allow for quick movement if necessary. "Oh Lord," Donna May whispered, pressing her hand to her chest. "Not again. Not tonight." Betty squared her shoulders with visible effort, trying to project strength she clearly didn't feel. "It's all right, Donna Mae. Just stay calm." The diner's front door exploded inward with unnecessary violence, the bell above it jangling frantically. As three men burst through, the leader was tall and lean with the predatory movement of a career criminal. Prison tattoos snaked up his arms, visible beneath a leather jacket that had seen better years. His eyes held the cold calculation of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain. Behind him came a stocky man with massive shoulders, his dirty baseball cap pulled low over piggy eyes that surveyed the diner like a butcher sizing up meat. The third was wiry and twitchy, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd spent too many years sampling his own product. All three carried themselves with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. Well, the leader drawled, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone from the rougher parts of Billings. "Looks like old Betty's still serving dinner. That's good, real good. Means business is picking up." They spread out across the diner with practiced efficiency, the stocky one positioning himself near the door while the twitchy one began prowling between the tables like a caged animal. The leader approached the counter where Betty stood frozen, his boots clicking ominously on the checkered floor. Chuck continued eating his burger with deliberate calm, but every sense was now fully alert. His peripheral vision tracked each man's position while his ears cataloged the subtle sounds that would tell him if any of them were armed. The leader's jacket hung in a way that suggested a shoulder holster, and the stocky one's right hand favored his hip in the classic pattern of someone carrying concealed. "Evening, ladies," the leader continued with mock politeness that made Chuck's jaw tighten. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." The profanity that followed would have made a sailor blush, each word chosen for maximum impact on the elderly women who clearly wanted nothing more than to run their small business in peace. The casual cruelty in their voices spoke of men who'd lost whatever humanity they might have once possessed. Donna Mae backed toward the kitchen, her face a mask of terror that spoke of previous encounters with these men. Betty remained at her post behind the counter, but Chuck could see her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the formica surface. The twitchy one had been scanning the diner's interior when his roving gaze fell on Chuck's corner booth. A sneer spread across his face, revealing teeth that methamphetamine had reduced to brown stumps. "Hey, boys," he called to his companions without taking his eyes off Chuck. "Looks like we got ourselves an audience tonight. What do you think about that, Grandpa?" Chuck set down his burger with deliberate precision and wiped his mouth with his napkin. His movements were unhurried, almost casual, but there was something in his stillness that would have warned a more observant man. He met the junkie's stare with calm blue eyes that had seen more violence than all three criminals combined. "Just enjoying my dinner," Chuck said quietly, his Texas drawl soft but carrying clearly across the suddenly silent diner. "No need to pay me any mind." The three men laughed, but it was the harsh sound of hyenas rather than genuine mirth. The leader slammed his palm down on the counter with enough force to make the cash register jump, causing Betty to flinch backward. "You know exactly why we're here, old lady, so let's not play games." His voice had shed any pretense of civility, revealing the cold menace beneath. "Mr. Torino wants his weekly payment, plus the late fee for keeping him waiting." Chuck watched, Betty's face crumple as she struggled to maintain her dignity. "Please, I explained to Jake last time. The bank delayed my loan application. I just need a few more days to—" "Jake, don't make the rules, Grandma." The stocky one interrupted from his position by the door. "Mr. Torino does. And Mr. Torino don't like excuses." The wiry addict had begun systematically ransacking the diner, overturning salt shakers and dumping sugar packets onto tables with gleeful malice. "Maybe she needs a reminder about what happens to businesses that don't pay their debts," he cackled, pulling condiment bottles from their holders. Betty's hands moved protectively to the cash register, a gesture that wasn't lost on the leader. "Look, I can give you what I have tonight. It's not the full amount, but it's something. Please, this place is all I have left." The desperation in her voice cut through Chuck like a blade. He'd heard that same tone from village elders in Vietnam, when local warlords came collecting their tribute. Some things never changed. Bullies were bullies, whether they wore military uniforms or leather jackets. The leader reached across the counter and yanked open the cash register with practiced efficiency. Bills scattered as he counted with exaggerated slowness, his lips moving like a child learning arithmetic. 67, 85, 93, $127. He looked up with theatrical disappointment. Betty, this is insulting. Mr. Torino asked for 500, and you give me pocket change. It's everything I have, Betty whispered, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I sold my husband's tools last week just to make rent. The stocky one laughed, a sound like grinding gravel. Should have thought about that before you decided to play hardball with Mr. Torino. While his companions continued their intimidation routine, the wiry one had made his way to the tip jar beside the coffee station. He upended it with obvious relish, coins cascading across the floor in a metallic avalanche. Donna May made a small sound of distress as her hard-earned tips scattered, but remained pressed against the kitchen doorway, too terrified to move. The leader pocketed the cash register money and surveyed Betty with the calculating gaze of a predator. Since you're short on cash, we'll have to get creative about payment. His eyes fixed on her hands. That's a nice wedding ring you got there. Looks like it might cover the difference. No, Betty's voice cracked. Please, not that. It was Robert's last gift before he died. I've never taken it off in 45 years. Should have thought about that before you stiffed Mr. Torino, the leader said, reaching across the counter toward her hand. Consider it a down payment on next week's collection. Betty jerked backward, clutching her hand to her chest. You can't. Please, take anything else, but not my ring. The cruelty in the leader's smile would have made a shark envious. Old lady, you don't seem to understand your situation here. Mr. Torino owns this town, which means he owns you. That ring, this diner, even that pathetic waitress hiding behind. You, it all belongs to him now. Chuck had heard enough. The chair legs scraped against the checkered floor as he stood slowly, his full height unfolding with deliberate precision. The sound cut through the criminal's laughter like a gunshot, drawing all eyes to the corner booth. I think, Chuck said, in a voice that carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, you gentlemen should leave these ladies alone. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. 3 sets of predatory eyes fixed on the soft-spoken stranger who had just made what they considered a fatal error in judgment. The 3 criminals turned toward Chuck with expressions that shifted from surprise to amusement in the space of a heartbeat. The leader's harsh laughter filled the diner, echoing off the vintage fixtures like the caw of a predatory bird. Did this old fossil just tell us what to do? Jake Morrison's voice dripped with mock disbelief as he swaggered away from the counter, his leather jacket creaking with each step. Boys, I think Grandpa here needs a lesson in minding his own business. Tommy Walsh, the stocky enforcer, cracked his knuckles with theatrical menace. Maybe he's having trouble with his hearing aid. Want me to speak up for him, Jake? The third man, Ray Stevens, pulled a switchblade from his pocket with a metallic snick that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. The blade caught the fluorescent light as he examined it with obvious affection. Or maybe the old-timer's got some kind of death wish. That would explain why he's sticking his nose where it don't belong. Chuck remained standing beside his booth, hands relaxed at his sides, his weathered face showing no more concern than if he'd been discussing the weather. His voice, when he spoke, carried the same measured cadence that had served him well in boardrooms and battlefields alike. I'm just suggesting you folks might want to reconsider your approach here, he said quietly. These ladies don't deserve this kind of treatment. The suggestion sent Jake into fresh peals of laughter. Oh, this is rich. This is really rich. The old man thinks he's some kind of hero. He turned to his companions with exaggerated amazement. Can you believe this guy? Probably thinks he's still back in the good old days when men were men and all that patriotic garbage. Tommy moved closer. To Chuck's booth, his bulk intended to intimidate. Listen here, Fossil. This ain't your fight, and this sure ain't your town. Why don't you finish your little dinner and hobble on back to the old folks' home before someone gets hurt? Yeah, Ray chimed in, testing the knife's edge against his thumb. Accidents happen all the time to folks who can't mind their own business, especially old folks with brittle bones. Through it all, Chuck's demeanor remained unchanged. His blue eyes tracked each man's movement with the calm assessment of someone who'd faced far worse threats than 3 small-town criminals. There was something in his stillness, a quality that suggested coiled springs rather than fragility, but the 3 thugs were too caught up in their own arrogance to notice. Betty and Donna May watched the confrontation with growing horror, both. Women understanding that their unexpected protector was hopelessly outmatched. The diner that had been their sanctuary now felt like a cage, with nowhere to run and no way to summon help. Jake stepped forward until he was within arm's reach of Chuck, close enough that the older man could smell the beer and cigarettes on his breath. "You know what your problem is, old-timer? You grew up in a different world. This ain't the 1950s anymore, when people respected their elders and all that feel-good bullshit. This is the real world, where the strong take what they want and the weak get out of the way." Chuck's expression didn't change, but his stance shifted almost imperceptibly. A trained martial artist would have recognized the subtle adjustment of weight, the slight repositioning of feet that prepared for explosive movement. To the three criminals, he still looked like nothing more than a harmless old man who'd wandered into the wrong conversation. "Last chance, Grandpa." Jake sneered, placing his palm flat against Chuck's chest. "Walk away now, or we'll make sure you leave here in an ambulance." With deliberate malice, Jake shoved Chuck hard, expecting to send the elderly man stumbling backward into the booth. Instead, Chuck absorbed the impact without moving so much as an inch, his body as immovable as a granite mountain. Jake's confident smirk faltered. "What the hell?" The moment Jake's hand made contact with Chuck's immovable chest, the atmosphere in the diner shifted like the sudden calm before a tornado. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, the three criminals stared at their intended victim in dawning confusion, their brains struggling to process why their intimidation tactics had suddenly stopped working. Chuck's response was surgical in its precision and devastating in its efficiency. His right hand moved faster than the human eye could follow, capturing Jake's extended wrist in a grip that felt like a steel vise. With a twist that utilized 40 years of martial arts mastery, Chuck executed a perfect Aikido technique that sent Jake's pistol sliding across the checkered floor like a hockey puck on ice. The gun came to rest near the jukebox, completely out of reach. Jake's scream of pain and surprise had barely begun when Tommy Walsh charged from the left like an enraged bull, his massive fists swinging in wild haymakers designed to crush rather than finesse. Chuck had faced charging opponents before, in dojos, in movies, and in the jungles of Vietnam, where hesitation meant death. He sidestepped Tommy's assault with the fluid grace of a matador, using the bigger man's momentum against him. A gentle redirection of force, combined with a precisely placed foot, sent Tommy crashing into the booth Chuck had recently vacated. The impact of 250 pounds of muscle meeting vinyl and chrome created a sound like a small car accident, complete with the musical tinkle of breaking glass as Tommy's elbow shattered a water pitcher. Ray Stevens, witnessing his companion's sudden misfortune, abandoned any pretense of intimidation and lunged forward with his switchblade extended, aiming for Chuck's midsection with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. The blade caught the fluorescent light as it arced toward its target, but Ray might as well have been moving in slow motion. Chuck's defensive block intercepted Ray's knife hand with the precision of a Swiss watch, deflecting the weapon harmlessly to one side. His counterattack was a controlled palm strike to Ray's solar plexus. Not enough force to cause permanent damage, but more than sufficient to send the wiry criminal crashing to the floor like a marionette with severed strings. The entire confrontation lasted exactly 28 seconds. Jake lay curled on his side, clutching his wrist and making sounds that fell somewhere between whimpering and cursing. Tommy had become intimately acquainted with the booth's chrome fixtures, his bulk wedged between the table and seat in a position that suggested several minutes of awkward extraction would be required. Ray sprawled near the counter, gasping like a fish out of water as he tried to remember how breathing was supposed to work. Chuck straightened his flannel shirt with the same casual motion he might use after a gentle breeze had ruffled it. He walked calmly back to his booth, stepped over Tommy's protruding legs with polite consideration, and settled back into his seat. His coffee was still warm. Betty and Donna May stood frozen in tableau, their minds struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. The transformation had been so complete and so swift that it felt almost like watching a magic trick. One moment, they'd been watching a helpless old man face impossible odds. The next, three dangerous criminals lay groaning on their floor while their protector calmly reached for his coffee cup. "Ma'am," Chuck said to Betty, his voice carrying the same courteous tone he'd used when ordering dinner, You might want to call the sheriff. These fellows seem to be having some difficulty getting up. The mundane suggestion, delivered in the aftermath of such extraordinary violence, finally broke through Donna May's paralysis. She began to laugh, not with humor, but with the hysterical relief of someone who'd just watched the impossible become reality. Chuck took another sip of his coffee and glanced at his burger, which had grown cold during the brief interruption. Some things, he reflected, were more important than maintaining the proper temperature of one's dinner. Sheriff Walt Brennan's patrol car slid to a stop outside Betty's diner, its flashing lights painting the vintage neon sign in alternating red and blue. The lawman emerged from his vehicle with his service weapon drawn, responding to the silent alarm that Betty had managed to activate during the chaos. At 58, Brennan carried himself with the measured confidence of someone who'd spent a quarter-century dealing with every variety of human trouble that rural Montana could produce. The bell above the diner's door chimed innocently as Brennan stepped inside, his trained eyes immediately cataloging the scene before him. 3 known criminals lay in various states of distress across the checkered floor, none of them appearing to pose an immediate threat. Behind the counter, Betty Patterson and Donna May stood unharmed but clearly shaken. And in the corner booth sat a stranger calmly sipping coffee, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Everyone all right in here?" Brennan's voice carried the authority of his badge, but his confusion was evident as he tried to piece together what had transpired. His weapon remained drawn but pointed safely downward as he approached the aftermath of what appeared to be a very one-sided confrontation. "We're fine, Sheriff," Betty managed, her voice still trembling with residual adrenaline. Thanks to him." She gestured toward Chuck with something approaching reverence. Brennan's gaze shifted to the stranger, taking in the flannel shirt, worn jeans, and cowboy boots of someone who looked like any of 1,000 other travelers passing through rural Montana. There was something familiar about the man's profile, something that tugged at the edges of memory, but Brennan couldn't quite place it. Chuck rose respectfully as the sheriff approached, extending his hand in the universal gesture of peaceful intentions. "Evening, Sheriff. I'm afraid these gentlemen were causing some trouble for the ladies here. Nothing serious, but they seem to need a moment to cool down." The voice triggered recognition like a key turning in a lock. Brennan's weapon lowered completely as his eyes widened in amazement. "Good Lord, Chuck Norris? What in Sam Hill are you doing in Millfield?" The name hit Betty and Donna May like a physical blow. Betty's hand flew to her mouth as she stared at the man who'd just saved them, while Donna May made a small sound that might have been either a gasp or a prayer. They'd just been rescued by a living legend, a man whose name was synonymous with justice and uncompromising strength. "Just passing through, Sheriff," Chuck replied with the modest demeanor that had always characterized his public appearances. "Stopped for dinner and found myself in the middle of a misunderstanding." Brennan holstered his weapon and approached Chuck with the enthusiasm of a longtime fan meeting his hero. "Sir, I can't tell you what an honor this is. I've seen every one of your movies, probably twice. And your karate championships. 6-time world champion, if I remember correctly." "You remember correctly," Chuck acknowledged with a slight smile. "Though that was a long time ago." Jake Morrison, still clutching his damaged wrist, had been listening to this exchange with growing horror. As the implications of what he'd just learned sank into his criminal mind, his face went the color of old newspaper. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice cracking with panic. "Oh sweet Jesus, we attacked Chuck Norris. Vinny's gonna kill us. He's gonna actually kill us." The outburst drew everyone's attention to the fallen criminal, whose terror had reached levels that bordered on hysteria. Tommy Walsh, still extracting himself from the booth's wreckage, looked equally stricken as he processed his leader's words. "Vinny." Brennan's expression hardened as he knelt beside Jake. "Vincent Torino? What's he got to do with this?" Jake's resolve crumbled completely under the weight of his situation. "Everything, man. This was a collection run. Standard shakedown for protection money. But we had no idea. Nobody told us Chuck Norris was going to be here." Chuck's expression grew serious as he absorbed this information. "Protection money? These ladies are being extorted." "For 2 years now," Brennan confirmed grimly, his professional demeanor replacing his earlier enthusiasm. "Torino's got his hooks in half the businesses in this county, and I haven't been able to touch him." He's got connections with corrupt state officials who block any investigation I try to start. The larger picture was beginning to form in Chuck's mind, and he didn't like what he was seeing. Small-town bullying backed by organized crime and protected by corrupt law enforcement was exactly the kind of injustice that had motivated him throughout his career, both real and fictional. Brennan's radio crackled to life with the harsh voice of his dispatcher. "Sheriff, you need to know. We just got word that Vincent Torino is en route from Billings with a full crew. Multiple vehicles spotted heading south on Highway 2. ETA approximately 6 hours." Chuck looked out the diner's window at the peaceful town beyond, knowing that peace was about to be shattered. The radio's ominous message hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, transforming the aftermath of Chuck's swift justice into the prelude of something far more serious. Sheriff Brennan's weathered face grew grim as he processed the implications of Torino's approaching convoy, while Betty and Donna May exchanged worried glances that spoke of previous encounters with the crime boss's particular brand of persuasion. "How many men typically travel with Torino?" Chuck asked, settling back into his booth as Brennan began securing the 3 criminals with zip-tie restraints. "Last time he came through, he had 8 vehicles and maybe 20 men," Brennan replied, checking Jake Morrison's injured wrist before securing it. "Mix of locals and out-of-state muscle. All armed, all mean as rattlesnakes." He paused in his work, meeting Chuck's steady gaze. "Mr. Norris, with all due respect, you might want to consider moving along before they arrive. This isn't your fight." Chuck's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew harder. "Sheriff, when I see good people being terrorized by bullies, it becomes my fight." Betty stepped forward from behind the counter, her hands still trembling, but her voice growing stronger. "You don't understand what you'd be up against. Vincent Torino isn't just some street thug. He's been bleeding this town dry for 2 years. Now." The pain in her voice drew Chuck's full attention. "Tell me." "It started small," Betty continued, sinking into the booth across from Chuck. "Just a few businesses paying what they called protection fees. But it spread like a cancer. Now, every shop, every restaurant, even the farmers coming to market, everyone pays Torino's tax." Donna May joined them, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light. "My nephew tried to resist when they came to his auto shop. 3 days later, his garage burned down. Insurance called it suspicious but couldn't prove anything." "And your husband?" Chuck asked gently, noting how Betty's hand moved protectively to her wedding ring. Betty's composure cracked slightly. "Robert owned this place with me for 23 years. When Torino's people first showed up, Robert told them where they could shove their protection money." Her voice dropped to a whisper. 6 months ago, Robert died in a car accident on Highway 191. Single vehicle crash on a clear night, on a road he'd driven 1,000 times. The implication hung heavy in the air. Chuck had seen enough of the world to recognize the signs of systematic intimidation backed by violence. It was the same pattern he'd witnessed in Southeast Asia, Central America, and countless other places, where the strong preyed on the weak while authorities looked the other way. "What about state law enforcement?" Chuck asked Sheriff Brennan. Brennan's laugh held no humor. "That's the beauty of Torino's operation. He's got Captain Luther Kane in his pocket, the man who supervises all state police activities in this region. Every time I try to build a case, Kane finds ways to lose evidence, reassign personnel, or claim jurisdiction issues. So the people of Millfield are completely on their own," Chuck observed. "Pretty much," Brennan confirmed. "I do what I can, but I'm one man with a limited budget against a criminal organization with unlimited resources and corrupt protection." Chuck stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the quiet main street. Porch lights glowed in houses, where families were settling in for the evening, unaware that their town's brief respite from terror was about to end. Children's bicycles lay scattered on front lawns, and an elderly couple walked their dog past the courthouse, enjoying the kind of simple peace that should be every American's birthright. "Mr. Norris," Betty said softly, "these aren't the kind of men you faced in your movies. Torino's killed people, good people who just wanted to live their lives without fear. If you stay, you'll be putting yourself in real danger." Chuck turned from the window, his expression resolute. "Ma'am, I've been in real danger before. The difference is, in the movies, I knew it was all make-believe. This is real life, where real people are suffering, and that's something I can't walk away from. Brennan's radio crackled again with an update that sent ice through everyone's veins. Sheriff, latest intel puts Torino's convoy at 40 miles out and closing fast. Recommend you secure the scene and take necessary precautions. Chuck checked his watch, just past 9 o'clock. Looks like we have until dawn to prepare. Prepare for what? Donna Mae asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. To give Mr. Torino a welcome he won't soon forget, Chuck replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent 50 years turning impossible odds into inevitable victories. Outside, Millfield slept peacefully, unaware that their long nightmare was about to enter its final chapter. The first rays of Montana sunshine filtered through Betty's diner windows as Chuck Norris stood outside the establishment, breathing in the crisp morning air that carried the scent of pine and distant snow. He'd spent the night at the Millfield Motor Lodge, a modest establishment that had seen better decades but offered clean sheets and strong coffee. Sleep had come fitfully, his mind processing the previous evening's events and the larger implications of what he'd stumbled into. Betty Patterson arrived at 5:30 sharp, keys jingling as she unlocked the diner's front door. She moved with the determined efficiency of someone who'd been opening this same business for over 2 decades. But Chuck noticed the way her eyes scanned the empty street before entering, checking for threats that had become all too familiar. Didn't expect to see you still here, Betty said as Chuck approached, though her tone suggested she was more relieved than surprised. Most folks would have been halfway to the state line by now. Not much point in running from problems, ma'am, Chuck replied, following her inside as she flipped on lights and began her morning routine. Besides, I've always found that the best way to solve a problem is to face it head-on. Betty moved behind the counter and started the coffee machine, her actions automatic after years of practice. Mr. Norris, I appreciate what you did last night, more than you'll ever know. But you need to understand what you're getting yourself into. Chuck settled into his usual booth and waited patiently as Betty gathered her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of accumulated grief and frustration. Torino's operation isn't just about collecting protection money, she began, wiping down the counter with unnecessary vigor. He's got his fingers in everything: drug dealing at the high school, loan sharking at the bar, even controlling which vendors the local businesses can use. Cross him in any way, and you don't just lose your livelihood, you lose everything. The coffee finished brewing with a cheerful gurgle that seemed incongruous with the serious conversation. Betty poured 2 cups and joined Chuck at his table, her calloused hands wrapped around the warm ceramic as if drawing strength from it. Robert tried to organize the other business owners, she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He figured if we all stood together, we could push back against the extortion. He was making real progress, too. Had about 15 families ready to go to the FBI as a group. Chuck waited, sensing there was more to the story. That's when they killed him, Betty said simply. Made it look like an accident, but Robert was the most careful driver in 3 counties. Never had so much as a fender bender in 40 years of driving. The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, despite the months that had passed. Chuck recognized the particular anguish of someone who'd lost their partner to violence, a grief he understood all too well. After Robert died, the other families backed down, Betty continued. Can't say I blame them. They saw what happened to someone who tried to fight back. Now I'm 3 months behind on the mortgage because every penny I make goes to Torino's weekly collection. The bank's threatening foreclosure next month. Before Chuck could respond, the diner's bell chimed as Donna Mae hurried through the door, her silver hair windblown and her face flushed with exertion. She clutched her purse, like a lifeline as she approached their table. Betty, honey, you need to know. I just passed the gas station, and Earl told me he counted 5 more cars with out-of-state plates heading this way, Donna Mae said breathlessly, words spreading fast about what happened here last night. Within an hour of Donna Mae's arrival, Betty's diner had transformed from a quiet breakfast spot into an impromptu town meeting. Word of the previous night's confrontation had spread through Millfield with the speed that only small towns could achieve, and residents had begun gathering to see the legend who'd stood up to Torino's enforcers. Chuck watched from his corner booth as people filtered in, mostly older residents whose weathered faces told stories of hard work and honest living. They spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances at the soft-spoken stranger who'd accomplished what their entire community had been unable to do for 2 years. The first to formally introduce himself was Eddie Kowalski, a wiry man of 69 whose bearing immediately marked him as former military. He walked with a slight limp from old injuries, but his green eyes held the alert intelligence of someone who'd seen combat and survived. His handshake was firm and brief, conveying respect without servility. Marine Corps, retired, Eddie said simply. Heard about what you did to those 3 idiots last night. About time someone showed them what real fighting looks like. Chuck recognized a kindred spirit in the old Marine. Always good to meet a fellow veteran. What was your specialty? Force recon, mostly Southeast Asia, Eddie replied, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone veterans used when discussing classified operations. Did some work with special operations units from other branches. Learned to appreciate quality when I saw it. Before Chuck could respond, another couple approached their table. The woman was petite but energetic, with silver hair styled neatly, and intelligent hazel eyes behind reading glasses. Her husband was a stocky man with powerful shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of decades in construction work. Margaret O'Sullivan, the woman said, extending her hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking charge. Everyone calls me Maggie. I taught elementary school here for 40 years, and this is my husband Frank. He built half the houses in this town. Frank's handshake nearly crushed Chuck's fingers, despite the older man's age. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Norris. My granddaughter's been watching your movies since she was old enough to tell the difference between good guys and bad guys. More residents continued to arrive, filling the diner beyond its normal capacity. Chuck met Carol Jensen, a worried mother whose 16-year-old son had been approached by drug dealers. Principal Amanda Foster, who'd been fighting a losing battle against criminal influence in her school, and Dr. Harold Mitchell, the town's only physician, who'd treated too many accidents that bore the hallmarks of professional intimidation. Each person who approached Chuck's table carried the same expression, a mixture of hope and desperate determination that spoke of people who'd been pushed to their breaking point. They weren't asking for a savior. They were looking for someone to show them how to save themselves. Eddie had positioned himself near the window, his military training making him a natural sentry. His sudden tension caught Chuck's attention immediately. We've got company, Eddie announced quietly. For vehicles approaching from the north. Black SUVs with tinted windows. The diner fell silent as every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Chuck stood and moved to the window, his trained eyes assessing the approaching convoy with tactical precision. The vehicles moved in formation, their aggressive styling and coordinated movement marking them as anything but casual travelers. Torino, Chuck asked. Has to be, Sheriff Brennan confirmed, his hand moving instinctively to his service weapon. He's early. Chuck watched the convoy slow as it reached the town's main intersection, the lead vehicle's windows rolling down. As occupants surveyed the peaceful street, even from a distance, he could sense the predatory anticipation radiating from the cars. How many people can this place hold? Chuck asked Betty. Maybe 40 if we pack them in tight, she replied. Why? Chuck turned from the window to address the gathered townspeople, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him a natural leader throughout his life. Folks, I think it's time you all headed home. This is about to get complicated, and I don't want anyone caught in the crossfire who doesn't need to be. With respect, Mr. Norris, Maggie O'Sullivan said firmly, this is our town and our fight. We've been running from these thugs for 2 years, and frankly, we're tired of it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled residents. Chuck saw the same determination in their faces that he'd witnessed in countless movies and real-life situations. Ordinary people who'd been pushed too far and were finally ready to push back. The convoy completed its reconnaissance and began moving toward the diner. The rumble of multiple engines filled the morning air as Vincent Torino's convoy roared down Millfield's main street with the theatrical aggression of a military parade. 4 black SUVs and 2 luxury sedans moved in. Tight formation, their tinted windows and aggressive styling designed to intimidate anyone who witnessed their passage. Chrome exhaust pipes belched unnecessarily loud engine noise, announcing their arrival to every resident within a mile radius. Chuck watched through the diner window as the vehicles arranged themselves in the parking lot with practiced precision, forming a semicircle that blocked all normal exit routes. Car doors opened in unison, disgorging men who carried themselves with the casual arrogance of professional criminals. Most wore expensive leather jackets despite the morning warmth, their clothing cut to conceal the weapons that bulged beneath. Vincent Torino emerged from the lead vehicle like a stage performer making his entrance. At 52, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never faced serious opposition to his authority. His tailored suit probably cost more than most Millfield residents made in 3 months, and his gold jewelry caught the Montana sunshine with deliberate ostentation. Everything about him screamed money gained through intimidation and violence. Everyone needs to leave. Now, Chuck's voice cut through the nervous murmur of conversation filling the diner. His tone brooked no argument, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. The assembled townspeople looked torn between their desire to support him and their recognition of the very real danger approaching their sanctuary. Eddie Kowalski was the first to speak, his Marine training making him comfortable with tactical assessments. "How many you count?" he asked Chuck. 12, maybe 15, Chuck replied, still watching the deployment outside. "All armed, all professional. This is an amateur hour." Despite Chuck's directive, several residents seemed reluctant to abandon him. Maggie O'Sullivan stepped forward, her schoolteacher instincts making her protective of someone she saw as defending her community. "Mr. Norris, we can't just leave you to face this alone," she protested. "These people have terrorized our town for 2 years. If you're willing to stand up to them, the least we can do is stand with you." "Ma'am, I appreciate the sentiment," Chuck replied, his eyes never leaving the window. "But this is exactly the kind of situation where good intentions can get people killed. These men aren't interested in a fair fight. They're here to make a point through overwhelming force." The diner's front door opened with enough violence to make the bell above it swing wildly. Vincent Torino stepped inside, flanked by 6 armed men, his cold eyes immediately scanning the crowded interior with predatory calculation. His expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of violence that seemed to follow him like a personal cloud. Well, Torino's voice carried the flat menace of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "Looks like Little Millfield's having some kind of community meeting. How touching." His gaze swept across the assembled residents before settling on Chuck with the intensity of a laser sight. Despite his reputation and obvious wealth, there was something in Torino's expression that suggested he understood exactly who he was dealing with and was arrogant enough to believe it didn't matter. "You must be the famous Chuck Norris," Torino continued, approaching the booth where Chuck sat. With casual confidence, "I have to admit, I'm honored. It's not every day a living legend visits my territory." Chuck remained seated, his posture relaxed but his eyes tracking every movement in the crowded diner. "Mr. Torino, I presume. I was just finishing my breakfast." "Oh, I think your breakfast is over," Torino replied with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "In fact, I think your entire visit to Millfield is over. You see, Mr. Norris, this is my town. These are my people. And what happened to my employees last night was a serious breach of protocol." The criminal boss gestured to his assembled crew, each man standing ready for violence despite the presence of innocent bystanders. "Now, I understand there might have been some confusion. Maybe these good folks didn't explain the local situation clearly enough. But I'm here to clarify things personally." Chuck's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather. "And what situation would that be?" "The situation where everyone in this county pays their fair share for protection and keeps their noses out of business that doesn't concern them," Torino explained with exaggerated patience. "Simple economics, really. I provide security, they provide compensation. Everyone stays happy and healthy. And if they refuse your generous offer?" Chuck asked. Torino's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect. "Well, Mr. Norris, that's where things get complicated. Fortunately, that almost never happens anymore. People in Millfield have learned to appreciate the value of cooperation." Chuck stood slowly, his full height unfolding with deliberate precision. Despite being outnumbered 12 to 1, His presence seemed to fill the diner with quiet menace. I think you'll find that some people are harder to convince than others. 1 hour, Torino announced, checking his expensive watch with theatrical precision. You have exactly 1 hour to collect your things and drive out of my territory. After that, I can't guarantee your safety, or the safety of anyone foolish enough to harbor you. Without waiting for a response, Torino turned and walked out of the diner, his entourage following like well-trained attack dogs. Through the window, Chuck watched them deploy around the town's main intersection, taking positions that would allow them to monitor all movement in and out of Millfield. The siege had begun. The abandoned warehouse behind Frank O'Sullivan's construction company provided the perfect cover for what Chuck had in mind. Built in the 1960s to store mining equipment, the cavernous space offered privacy from Torino's watchers and enough room for the kind of training that would give Millfield's residents their first real chance at fighting back. Chuck stood in the center of the concrete floor, surrounded by Eddie Kowalski, Maggie and Frank O'Sullivan, and Sheriff Brennan. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through high windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that seemed inappropriate for planning what amounted to guerrilla warfare. First thing you need to understand, Chuck began, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space, is that we're not trying to match Torino's firepower. We're going to be smarter, faster, and more prepared than his people expect. Eddie nodded approvingly, his Marine training making him comfortable with unconventional tactics, asymmetric warfare. Use their strengths against them and exploit their weaknesses. Exactly, Chuck confirmed. Torino's people are used to intimidating scared civilians. They're not prepared for organized resistance from people who know what they're doing. Maggie O'Sullivan had brought a detailed map of Millfield, which she spread across an old workbench. Her teacher's instincts made her a natural organizer, and she'd already begun marking key locations with colored pencils. Based on what Sheriff Brennan told us, Torino's local operations center around 3 main activities, she said, pointing to various spots on the map. Drug dealing at the high school, loan sharking at Murphy's Bar, and the protection racket. That hits every business on Main Street. Frank studied the map with the practical eye of someone who'd built half the structures marked on it. If we're going to disrupt their operations, we need to hit them where it hurts their income. Take away their money flow, and Torino loses his ability to pay for muscle. Chuck appreciated the older man's tactical thinking. That's the idea. But before we do anything, everyone who's willing to help needs basic training in self-defense. Torino's people won't hesitate to use violence against anyone they see as a threat. Over the next 2 hours, Chuck began teaching a crash course in personal protection to the growing group of volunteers who'd answered Eddie's discreet recruitment calls. Dr. Mitchell arrived with his medical bag, prepared to treat training injuries. Principal Foster brought her knowledge of the high school's layout and security weaknesses. Even Donna May showed up, her silver hair pinned back and her face set with determination that surprised everyone who knew her gentle nature. The key to effective self-defense isn't strength, Chuck explained as he demonstrated basic blocking techniques. It's leverage, timing, and using your opponent's momentum against them. He paired each volunteer with someone of similar size and began teaching them simple but effective moves, how to break free from a wrist grab, how to use everyday objects as improvised weapons, how to create distance and escape from dangerous situations. Eddie worked with the younger volunteers, his military experience making him an effective instructor for more aggressive techniques. Remember, he told them, the goal isn't to win a fight. The goal is to survive long enough to get help or get away. Maggie had set up a communication network using the town's remaining landlines and a few secure cell phones Sheriff Brennan had provided. If anyone spots trouble, they call the designated number and we spread the word, she explained. No one acts alone, and everyone has backup. Frank had been quietly inventorying the warehouse's contents, finding an unexpected treasure trove of useful items. Got crowbars, hammers, rope, even some old safety equipment, he reported. Nothing fancy, but tools that could come in handy if things get rough. As the afternoon training session wound down, Chuck felt cautiously optimistic about the group's potential. They weren't professional fighters, but they had something Torino's hired muscle lacked: genuine motivation to protect their home and families. The warehouse door opened to admit Carol Jensen, her face flushed with anger and fear. The young mother practically ran across the concrete floor to where Chuck stood cooling down from the training session. "Mr. Norris, thank God you're still here," she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "It's my son Tyler. Those dealers at the high school, they cornered him after school today." Chuck's expression hardened as he absorbed the implications. "What happened?" "They told him he had a choice," Carol continued, her voice breaking with maternal fury. "Start selling their drugs to his classmates, or they'd make sure he had an accident like some other kids who didn't cooperate." The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of Carol's labored breathing. Chuck looked around at the faces of the people who'd spent the afternoon learning to defend themselves, seeing his own anger reflected in their expressions. "Looks like it's time for a field trip to the high school," Chuck said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of justice that had made him a legend. Millfield High School stood like a brick monument to better times, its 1950s architecture speaking of an era when education was a community priority and children could walk safely to class. Chuck approached the campus at 3:15, timing his arrival to coincide with the afternoon dismissal when Torino's dealers would be working their most vulnerable targets. Principal Amanda Foster had provided him with detailed intelligence. During the warehouse training session, the drug operation centered around two men who positioned themselves near the student parking lot each afternoon, using a combination of free samples and intimidation to recruit teenage dealers from the school's most desperate families. Chuck spotted them immediately as students began streaming from the building's main entrance. Rico Martinez stood near a rusted pickup truck, his expensive sneakers and gold chain contrasting sharply with the modest vehicles surrounding him. At 26, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd found easy money in a hard world. His partner, Danny Williams, earned his nickname Smoke from both his product and his chain-smoking habit that left him constantly wreathed in cigarette haze. They worked with practiced efficiency, targeting students who walked alone or appeared particularly downcast. Chuck watched from across the street as they approached a thin boy with second-hand clothes and desperate eyes, offering him a small package with promises of easy money and social acceptance. Chuck crossed the street with the measured pace of someone taking a casual stroll, his hands in his jacket pockets and his expression betraying nothing more threatening than mild curiosity. Several students recognized him from news coverage of his movies and charitable work, their whispered conversations creating a ripple effect through the dispersing crowd. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Chuck said pleasantly as he approached the two dealers. "Beautiful day for spending time with young people, isn't it?" Rico looked up from his sales pitch with the irritated expression of someone whose business had been interrupted by an unwelcome observer. "You lost, old man. Senior Center's about 6 blocks that way." Danny flicked his cigarette toward Chuck's feet with deliberate disrespect. "Yeah, this ain't exactly your demographic, Grandpa. Why don't you shuffle along before you hurt yourself?" The teenager they'd been pressuring seized the opportunity to escape, hurrying toward the bus stop with obvious relief. Chuck watched him go with satisfaction before turning his attention back to the two dealers. "Actually, I think this is exactly where I need to be," Chuck replied, his tone remaining conversational despite the menace gathering in his eyes. "See, I've got a problem with grown men who prey on children." Rico's hand moved instinctively toward the bulge under his jacket, but Chuck's next words stopped him cold. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action, son. I'd hate for these students to see something that might give them nightmares." Danny had been reaching for something in his pocket, probably a knife or brass knuckles, when Chuck moved with the lightning speed that had made him legendary. A simple wrist control technique disarmed Rico so quickly that his pistol seemed to vanish from his hand and reappear, sliding across the asphalt. Danny's switchblade never even cleared his pocket before Chuck's defensive block numbed his entire arm. The confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds. Rico found himself sitting hard on the pavement, staring up at the sky and wondering how he'd gotten there. Danny was doubled over, gasping for breath and trying to remember how his lungs were supposed to work that a crowd of students had gathered at a respectful distance, their cell phones capturing every moment of what would become the most-watched video in Millfield High's history. Chuck turned to address them, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to teaching important lessons. "Students, I want you to remember something," he said, his words reaching every teenager in the parking lot. When someone offers you something that seems too good to be true, it usually is. These men weren't here to help you. They were here to use you. Real strength comes from making smart choices, not from what you can buy or sell. Several students nodded thoughtfully, while others looked ashamed of their previous interest in Rico's offers. Chuck could see the impact of his words in their faces, the way young people responded when adults spoke to them with respect rather than condescension. Principal Foster appeared at Chuck's elbow, having watched the confrontation from her office window. "Mr. Norris, I can't thank you enough. These two have been terrorizing our students for months. Just doing what any responsible adult should do," Chuck replied, helping Rico to his feet with surprising gentleness. "Though I suspect these gentlemen will find somewhere else to conduct their business from now on." Rico and Danny stumbled toward their truck, both men moving with the careful precision of people who'd just learned a valuable lesson about underestimating their opponents. As they drove away, Chuck noticed several students approaching with questions and requests for advice. For the first time in 2 years, Millfield High's parking lot felt safe. Word of the high school incident spread through Millfield with the speed of wildfire, carried by teenagers' text messages and their parents' phone calls. By evening, Chuck had become something more than a celebrity visitor. He'd become a symbol of hope for a community that had almost forgotten what fighting back looked like. Eddie Kowalski found him at Betty's Diner just after sunset, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of a military man who'd watched a successful operation unfold. "Heard you made quite an impression on the local pharmaceutical industry," he said, sliding into the booth across from Chuck. "Just a little consumer education," Chuck replied with a slight smile. Amazing how quickly people can learn when they're properly motivated. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Harold Mitchell, who approached their table with the urgent bearing of someone carrying bad news. At 64, the town's only physician had spent years treating injuries that bore the unmistakable signs of professional intimidation, and his medical oath conflicted daily with his inability to help his patients seek justice. "Mr. Norris, I hate to interrupt your dinner, but we have a situation," Dr. Mitchell said quietly. "Morton Hess, he's 78, lives alone since his wife passed. He's been cornered by one of Torino's loan sharks. The man's threatening to take Morton's house tomorrow if he doesn't pay $5,000 in accumulated interest." Chuck set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Where?" "Morton's place on Elm Street. The loan shark's name is Carlo Benedetti. Big guy. Drives a red Camaro, carries brass knuckles." Dr. Mitchell's hands shook slightly as he spoke. "Morton came to me this afternoon with bruises on his ribs. Says Benedetti gave him a preview of what happens to people who don't pay their debts." Eddie was already standing, his marine instincts making him ready for immediate action. "Sounds like Mr. Benedetti needs to learn some manners." The drive to Elm Street took less than 5 minutes, but Chuck used the time to gather intelligence from Dr. Mitchell about Torino's loan sharking operation. The predatory lending targeted elderly residents and struggling families, offering quick cash at impossible interest rates that trapped borrowers in permanent debt cycles. Morton Hess's modest house showed signs of a lifetime of careful maintenance. A tidy front yard, freshly painted shutters, and a vegetable garden that spoke of someone who took pride in his home. The red Camaro parked aggressively across the driveway seemed like a deliberate insult to the neighborhood's peaceful character. Through the front window, Chuck could see Morton seated at his kitchen table while a large man in an expensive tracksuit gestured threateningly. The elderly widower's body language spoke of someone who'd been beaten down by circumstances beyond his control. Chuck approached the front door with Eddie flanking him, both men moving with the quiet coordination of experienced operators. The conversation inside was clearly audible through the thin walls. "Tomorrow, old man. $5,000, or I start taking your stuff piece by piece." Benedetti's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who enjoyed inflicting financial torture. "Maybe I'll start with that fancy television, then work my way up to the deed on this dump." Chuck knocked on the door with polite firmness. When Benedetti opened it, his face showed first surprise, then recognition, then the dawning realization that his afternoon had just become much more complicated. "Mr. Benedetti, I presume," Chuck said pleasantly. "I understand you're having a business discussion with Mr. Hess. Mind if we join you?" The loan shark's hand moved toward his pocket, but Eddie's military bearing and Chuck's legendary reputation gave him pause. This is private business, old man. Move along. Actually, predatory lending becomes everyone's business when it targets vulnerable seniors. Chuck replied, stepping past Benedetti into the house with the confidence of someone who'd never met. A locked door he couldn't open. What followed was a brief but educational conversation about the ethics of charging 400% interest to elderly widowers on fixed incomes. Benedetti left Morton's house with a new understanding of why some debts should simply be forgiven, while Morton discovered that his mortgage papers contained several irregularities that would void the entire agreement, by the time they returned to town. Chuck and Eddie had also paid visits to Murphy's Bar, where Torino's collectors had been pressuring the owner to use only approved vendors at inflated prices, and Davidson's Hardware, where the owner had been forced to hire Torino's security consultants to prevent mysterious break-ins. Each successful intervention built the town's confidence, proving that Torino's empire wasn't as unshakable as it appeared. More importantly, Chuck was documenting every illegal activity they uncovered, building a case that even corrupt officials would find difficult to ignore. As midnight approached, Millfield felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight that had been pressing down on the community for 2 years had finally begun to lift. Morning brought an unexpected sight to Millfield's main street, Torino's. Remaining enforcers packing their equipment and loading their vehicles with the efficient movements of people preparing for a hasty departure. Chuck watched from Betty's diner window as 3 black SUVs and a sedan formed a convoy near the courthouse, their occupants moving with none of the swagger they displayed just days before. "Well, I'll be damned," Sheriff Brennan muttered, joining Chuck at the window with a cup of coffee and an expression of cautious amazement. "Looks like they're actually pulling out." Betty Patterson emerged from the kitchen, her face showing the first genuine hope Chuck had seen since their initial meeting. "You really think they're leaving for good?" "Hard to believe," Eddie Kowalski said from his position near the counter. But even the old Marine's habitual skepticism seemed tempered by the evidence before their eyes. Torino doesn't seem like the type to give up easy money. Through the window, they watched the last of Torino's vehicles disappear down Highway 191, heading north toward Billings with their tinted windows and out-of-state plates. The absence of their intimidating presence immediately changed the town's atmosphere, like the lifting of a storm cloud that had been blocking the sun. Within an hour, the transformation was remarkable. Children appeared on the streets for the first time in weeks, riding bicycles and playing games that had been too dangerous when Torino's watchers occupied every corner. Store owners began removing the closed signs that had become permanent fixtures during the worst of the extortion campaign. Chuck spent the morning visiting businesses throughout Millfield, checking on owners who'd been terrorized into compliance with Torino's demands. At every stop, he found the same thing. People emerging from their self-imposed hiding places like survivors of a long siege finally seeing rescue arrive. Margaret O'Sullivan had organized an impromptu committee meeting at the community center, where longtime residents discussed plans for repairing the damage Torino's reign had inflicted on their town. Frank was already calculating the cost of repairing broken windows and replacing security systems that would no longer be necessary. "First thing we need to do is get that community watch program back up and running," Maggie declared, her teacher's instincts making her naturally focused on long-term solutions. "We can't let something like this happen again." Dr. Mitchell arrived with news that 3 families who'd left town during the worst of Torino's control were planning to return now that the threat had passed. The Hendersons want to reopen their bakery, and Jim Walsh is talking about bringing his auto repair shop back from Great Falls. Even Principal Foster seemed energized by the change, reporting that several students who'd been too frightened to attend school regularly were already asking about making up missed assignments. "For the first time in 2 years, I'm actually looking forward to Monday morning," she confessed as evening approached. The celebration became official when Betty announced that dinner at the diner would be on the house for everyone who'd helped reclaim their town. Tables were pushed together to accommodate the growing crowd, and Donna May found herself serving more meals in one evening than she'd typically handle in a week. Chuck sat surrounded by people whose lives had been fundamentally changed by his intervention, their gratitude evident in every handshake and word of thanks. Children who'd been afraid to play outside now approached him for autographs and pictures, while their parents struggled to find words adequate to express their appreciation. "You know," Morton Hess said, raising his coffee cup in an impromptu toast, "I was starting to think this town would never feel like home again. Seems I was wrong." The sentiment was echoed throughout the diner as residents shared stories of small freedoms they'd regained, walking to the store without fear, letting their children ride bikes after dark, opening their businesses without calculating protection payments into their budgets. Eddie caught Chuck's eye and nodded toward the window, where Millfield's main street showed signs of life that had been absent for months. "Looks like your work here is done." Chuck was about to respond when the first set of headlights appeared in the distance, followed quickly by several more. The vehicles approaching the town moved with the coordinated precision of a law enforcement convoy, their red and blue emergency lights beginning to flash as they entered Millfield's city limits. The celebration in Betty's diner fell silent as everyone realized their nightmare was about to begin again. The convoy of law enforcement vehicles filled Millfield's main street with flashing lights and the authority of official badges, but something about their deployment felt wrong to Chuck's trained eye. State police cars positioned themselves with tactical precision around Betty's diner, their occupants emerging with the coordinated movements of a military unit rather than peace officers responding to a routine call. Captain Luther Kane stepped out of the lead vehicle, his tall frame imposing in the perfectly pressed state police uniform that seemed designed more for intimidation than practical law enforcement. At 49, he carried himself with the rigid bearing of someone who'd learned to use legitimate authority for illegitimate purposes, his cold gray eyes scanning the diner's interior through the large windows. Everyone remained calm and seated, Kane announced as he entered the diner, flanked by 12 heavily armed officers whose tactical gear suggested they were prepared for a war zone rather than a small-town restaurant. Their faces were hidden behind visors and masks, making them appear more like an occupying army than peace officers. Chuck remained in his booth, recognizing the choreographed nature of what was unfolding. This wasn't a routine police response. It was a carefully planned operation designed to look official while serving criminal purposes. "Charles Norris." Kane's voice carried the flat precision of someone reading from a prepared script. "You are under arrest for assault with intent to commit bodily harm, conspiracy to interfere with lawful business operations, and violation of state statutes regarding vigilante activities." The charges were obviously fabricated, but Kane produced official-looking paperwork with the confidence of someone who'd corrupted the system so thoroughly that documentation was merely a formality. Chuck noticed that several of the officers carried themselves like professional criminals rather than trained law enforcement, their movements betraying street experience rather than academy training. "This is ridiculous," Sheriff Brennan protested, rising from his seat near the counter. Mr. Norris acted in self-defense, and those men were committing armed robbery. "Sheriff Brennan, you're outside your jurisdiction here," Kane replied coldly. "This is a state matter involving federal organized crime statutes. I suggest you stand down before you find yourself facing similar charges." The threat was clear, and Brennan's frustrated expression showed he understood the futility of fighting a system that had been corrupted from within. Chuck caught the sheriff's eye and gave him a subtle shake of the head, indicating he should avoid any action that might make the situation worse. As Kane's men moved to place handcuffs on Chuck, the diner's front door opened to admit Vincent Torino, his expensive suit and smug expression providing stark contrast to the tactical gear surrounding him. His presence confirmed what Chuck had already suspected. This arrest was choreographed theater designed to remove the primary obstacle to Torino's control of Millfield. Well, Torino said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning had finally paid off. The famous Chuck Norris, brought low by the very system he thought he could circumvent. How poetic. Chuck submitted to the handcuffs without resistance, recognizing that violence would only endanger the innocent people who'd gathered to celebrate their brief taste of freedom. As the metal restraints clicked into place, he caught Eddie Kowalski's eyes and gave him an almost imperceptible nod, a military signal that the old Marine would recognize from their shared past. "You people need to understand something," Torino continued, addressing the stunned crowd in the diner. "This town belongs to me. It has always belonged to me. Your little hero worship fantasy is over, and normal business will resume immediately." Kane's officers began ushering Chuck toward the door, their movements suggesting they were eager to remove him from public view as quickly as possible. As they reached the entrance, Torino's voice followed them with one final threat. "Oh, and, folks," the crime boss added with theatrical casualness, "the events of the past few days have created some administrative complications. Normal protection rates will resume tomorrow, plus a 50% penalty for the inconvenience you've caused. I trust there won't be any further misunderstandings about who runs this town." Chuck was loaded into an armored transport vehicle, but not before he saw the crushing defeat in the faces of people who'd briefly believed their nightmare was over. As the convoy pulled away from Betty's diner, Millfield's Main Street returned to the fearful silence that had characterized it for the past 2 years. The trap had been sprung with devastating effectiveness. And Chuck found himself exactly where Torino wanted him: isolated, restrained, and removed from the people he'd tried to protect. The armored transport vehicle wound through Montana's mountain highways for nearly an hour before reaching its destination, a remote county detention facility that looked more like a fortress than a place of justice. Chuck observed the route carefully through the small reinforced window, noting landmarks and calculating distances with the tactical awareness that had served him well in hostile territories around the world. The facility itself was a squat concrete structure surrounded by razor wire and floodlights. Built in the 1970s when isolation was considered the primary requirement for housing dangerous criminals. Its location 40 miles from Millfield ensured that any rescue attempt would face significant logistical challenges, while its aged infrastructure provided numerous opportunities for accidents to occur without witnesses. Captain Kane personally supervised Chuck's processing, his cold efficiency suggesting this wasn't his first time arranging someone's disappearance. Cell Block D, maximum isolation. He instructed the guards with the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. No visitors, no phone calls, no contact with the outside world. Chuck was placed in a windowless cell barely large enough for a cot and toilet, the kind of sensory deprivation designed to break a prisoner's spirit within days. Kane and Torino stood outside the bars, their voices carrying clearly in the concrete corridor as they discussed their plans with the casual tone of businessmen reviewing quarterly projections. "How long before the transfer?" Torino asked, checking his expensive watch with theatrical precision. 48 hours, Kane replied. "That gives us time to prepare the documentation and arrange for the incident during transport." Suicide attempt, of course, couldn't handle the shame of being arrested, became violent with the guards, unfortunate but necessary use of force. Chuck sat on his narrow cot and began the meditation techniques he'd learned decades ago, controlling his breathing and heart rate while his mind cataloged every detail of his imprisonment. Guard rotations occurred every 6 hours. The facility's electrical system dated from the Carter administration. The concrete walls showed hairline cracks that suggested structural weaknesses. Meanwhile, back in Millfield, Torino's full crew had returned with a vengeance that made their previous extortion efforts seemed gentle by comparison. Armed men kicked in the doors of businesses that had dared to celebrate their brief freedom, demanding immediate payment of accumulated fees plus the 50% penalty Torino had promised. Betty Patterson stood behind her diner's counter, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she handed over her wedding ring to Jake Morrison, who'd returned from his hospital visit with his wrist in a cast and murder in his eyes. The simple gold band that had never left her finger for 45 years disappeared into his pocket with no more ceremony than if he'd been collecting pocket change. "Deed to this place, too," Jake demanded, his voice thick with the satisfaction of someone finally able to exact revenge for his humiliation. "Mr. Torino's decided your rent just went up significantly." With trembling hands, Betty produced the property documents that represented everything she and Robert had built together. As Jake snatched them away, she could almost hear her late husband's voice urging her to fight back. But what was one elderly woman against an army of criminals protected by corrupt law enforcement? Dr. Mitchell's clinic was vandalized when he couldn't produce the $3,000 Torino claimed he owed for medical consultation fees. Principal Foster watched helplessly as dealers returned to her school, this time with official-looking badges that Kane had provided to legitimize their presence that BY evening. Millfield had returned to the fearful silence that characterized a community under occupation, but this time the oppression carried the additional weight of hope betrayed and heroes fallen. The systematic destruction of Millfield's brief rebellion continued through the night as Torino's enforcers went door to door with collection lists that seemed to grow longer by the hour. Families who'd hidden their meager savings were forced to surrender everything they'd managed to accumulate during the few days when protection payments had ceased. Eddie Kowalski's small house on Pine Street became the unlikely headquarters for what would become the most important military operation Millfield had ever seen. The old Marine had drawn his curtains and disabled his porch light, creating the kind of secure environment he'd learned to establish in hostile territory decades ago. Sheriff Brennan arrived first, moving through Eddie's backyard with the careful steps of someone who understood they were now operating outside the law. His badge meant nothing when the system itself had been corrupted, leaving him no choice but to work with civilian resistance fighters. Maggie and Frank O'Sullivan followed within minutes, the retired teacher carrying a thermos of coffee in her husband lugging a canvas bag filled with tools that might prove useful for what they were planning. Principal Foster slipped in through the back door just after midnight, her administrative skills making her invaluable for coordination and logistics. Carol Jensen was the last to arrive, her mother's fury at what Torino's dealers were doing to her community's children overriding any concern for her personal safety. She'd left her son with trusted neighbors, knowing that what they were about to attempt would either free Millfield or make them all targets for Torino's revenge. Eddie spread a highway map across his kitchen table, marking the route between the detention facility and the state prison where Chuck was supposedly being transferred. His weathered finger traced the mountain roads with the precision of someone who'd studied terrain for tactical advantages in multiple wars. Transports. Scheduled to leave at 0600, Eddie began, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a military briefing. That puts them on this stretch of Highway 191 around 0730, assuming they follow standard protocols. What makes you think they'll stick to standard protocols? Brennan asked, his law enforcement experience making him naturally suspicious. Of plans that relied on predictable behavior, Eddie's smile held no humor. Because Kane's overconfident. He thinks he's dealing with small-town civilians who'll roll over and play dead once their hero's been removed. He doesn't know he's up against someone who served with Chuck Norris in special operations. The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. Maggie O'Sullivan's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips, while Frank's bushy eyebrows rose toward his receding hairline. Even Brennan, who thought he knew everyone's background in the county, stared at Eddie with new understanding. Vietnam, 1971. Eddie continued, his voice dropping to the reverent tone veterans used when discussing classified operations. Can't tell you everything, but Chuck and I were part of the same unit. Twice he pulled me out of situations where I should have died. Once when our extraction went sideways near the DMZ, and again when we were compromised during a prisoner rescue mission. He pointed to the scar on his left temple, barely visible beneath his gray crew cut. Shrapnel from a mortar round that Chuck shielded me from with his own body. Spent 3 weeks in a Hanoi hospital thinking I'd never see home again, until Chuck came back for me. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of an old clock on the wall. Carol Jensen was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. He came back for you? Against direct orders, Eddie confirmed. Command had written me off as Kia, but Chuck knew better. He spent 2 weeks planning an extraction that everyone said was impossible, then walked into hell and carried me out on his back. Maggie wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. And now we're going to return the favor. Damn right we are, Frank growled, his construction workers' hands clenching into fists. Nobody gets left behind. Eddie pulled out a detailed topographical map and began explaining the plan that had been forming in his mind since Chuck's arrest. A staged accident on the mountain highway. Diversionary tactics to split the guard's attention. Precision timing that would give Chuck the window he needed to escape. Chuck taught us something in Vietnam, Eddie said as he finished outlining their strategy. Sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when the odds are against you. Especially when the odds are against you. As dawn approached, each member of the rescue team knew their role in what would either be Millfield's salvation or their final act of defiance. The rescue team spent the pre-dawn hours in Eddie's garage, surrounded by equipment that transformed the space into something resembling a military supply depot. Frank had contributed tools from his construction company, ropes, pulleys, and cutting equipment that could create obstacles or clear them as needed. Sheriff Brennan had provided radios and tactical gear from his department's emergency supplies, while Maggie organized communications and logistics with the efficiency of someone who'd managed elementary school evacuations for 4 decades. Eddie worked methodically through his own collection of items that spoke of a military career that had extended far beyond his official service record. Night vision equipment, signal flares, and other gear that suggested his special operations experience had been more extensive than he'd initially revealed. "Tell us about the prisoner rescue," Carol Jensen said quietly as she helped Eddie check. "Radio frequencies. The one where Chuck came back for you." Eddie paused in his equipment check, his weathered hands still for a moment as memories from half a century ago reasserted themselves with vivid clarity. "Firebase Charlie, about 15 clicks north of Da Nang. Our mission was to extract a captured pilot before he could be moved to a permanent prison facility." As Eddie spoke, the garage seemed to fade away, replaced by the humid jungle of Southeast Asia, where young men had learned that survival depended on trusting their teammates completely. His voice carried the matter-of-fact tone veterans used when discussing events that had shaped their understanding of courage and sacrifice. "Chuck was our team leader, though he was barely 25 at the time. Already had a reputation for bringing everyone home, no matter what the cost. When the extraction went sideways and I got separated from the team, standard procedure was to abort and report me Kia." Frank O'Sullivan found himself leaning forward, drawn into a story that revealed the man behind the legend they'd all grown up watching on movie screens. But Chuck didn't follow standard procedure. Chuck never followed procedure when it meant abandoning someone who was depending on him, Eddie confirmed. Spent 2 weeks gathering intelligence, studying guard patterns, learning the layout of the prison compound. Then he walked in alone, neutralized 6 guards without firing a shot, and carried me out through 3 miles of hostile territory. Maggie shook her head in amazement. "How is that even possible?" "Because Chuck understood something that most people never learn," Eddie explained, his eyes distant with memory. "Real strength isn't about physical power or martial arts techniques. It's about refusing to give up on the people who count on you, even when giving up would be easier." As Eddie continued his story, the others began to understand that they weren't just attempting to rescue a celebrity who'd wandered into their town's problems. They were saving someone who'd spent his entire life putting other people's welfare ahead of his own safety, who'd earned the loyalty they were about to demonstrate through decades of similar actions. Principal Foster arrived just before sunrise, with intelligence gathered from her network of teacher friends throughout the county. Transport vehicle left the detention facility at 05:45. Single escort car, following the route exactly as Eddie predicted. Sheriff Brennan checked his watch and nodded to the team. "Time to move. Remember, we get one chance at this. If we fail, Chuck dies and Torino owns this town forever." The rescue team loaded into Frank's construction truck and Maggie's sedan, their vehicles chosen for their ordinary appearance and practical cargo capacity. As they drove toward their predetermined positions along Highway 191, each person understood that they were about to attempt something that would either become a local legend or a cautionary tale about what happened to civilians who challenged professional criminals. Eddie rode in the passenger seat of Frank's truck, his eyes scanning the mountain terrain with the tactical awareness of someone who'd learned to read landscapes for defensive advantages and escape routes. The highway curved through dense forest that provided excellent cover for what they were planning, while the morning mist would help conceal their movements from the transport's escorts. "Contact in 15 minutes, Eddie announced over the radio, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who'd successfully completed similar operations before. "Everyone remember, we're not trying to win a war. We're just bringing our teammate home." The mountains of Montana stretched ahead of them, beautiful and unforgiving, about to become the stage for an operation that would determine whether justice or corruption would control Millfield's future. Highway 191 wound through the Montana mountains like a ribbon of asphalt connecting isolated communities to the wider world, its curves and elevation changes creating perfect conditions for what Eddie's team had in mind. The old Marine had chosen this particular stretch with the tactical precision of someone who'd spent years studying terrain for its defensive and offensive possibilities. Frank O'Sullivan positioned his construction truck at a strategic curve, where the highway narrowed between granite cliff faces, while Eddie and Maggie took covering positions in the dense pine forest that flanked both sides of the road. Sheriff Brennan waited a half-mile ahead, ready to block any attempt by Kane's backup units to interfere with the operation. The accident they created was a masterpiece of misdirection. Frank's truck appeared to have suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure, blocking half the highway while its driver struggled with what looked like a blown engine. Steam from carefully placed containers created the visual effect of an overheated radiator, while Frank played the part of a frustrated motorist with the conviction of someone who'd actually experienced such breakdowns. The armored transport approached the obstruction at exactly 7:32 a.m., its three-man crew following protocols that had been designed for routine prisoner transfers rather than coordinated rescue operations. The driver slowed cautiously as he assessed the apparent traffic obstacle, while his partners radioed their position and prepared to investigate. Chuck sensed the change in the vehicle's momentum immediately, his decades of experience in hostile situations making him alert to any deviation from expected patterns. Through the reinforced windows, he could see Frank O'Sullivan's truck positioned with the kind of precision that suggested planning rather than accident. The transport guards emerged to investigate the obstruction with the casual confidence of men who'd never encountered serious resistance during routine operations. Their attention focused entirely on the apparent mechanical emergency, leaving Chuck temporarily unobserved in the vehicle's secure compartment. Chuck's escape from his restraints demonstrated why legends were made from more than just movie roles. Using techniques learned in special operations training and refined through decades of martial arts practice, he manipulated the handcuffs with pressure points and leverage that turned security devices into tools for his liberation. The guards outside were still examining Frank's truck when Chuck emerged from the transport vehicle, moving with the fluid silence of someone who'd learned stealth in jungles where detection meant death. His approach was so quiet that the first guard never knew Chuck was behind him until a precisely applied sleeper hold rendered him unconscious. The second guard turned at the sound of his partner collapsing, but Chuck was already moving with the lightning speed that had made him legendary. A controlled strike to the solar plexus dropped the man without permanent injury, while the third guard found himself facing an opponent whose reputation hadn't prepared him for the reality of Chuck's capabilities. Eddie and Maggie provided covering fire from the forest as Kane's backup units arrived, their shots aimed to discourage pursuit rather than inflict casualties. The sound of gunfire echoed off the mountain walls like thunder, creating an acoustic environment that made accurate return fire nearly impossible for Kane's officers. Chuck disappeared into the dense pine forest with the grace of someone who'd learned forest movement from the best instructors the military could provide. His path through the wilderness avoided the obvious escape routes that pursuing officers would expect, instead following animal trails and natural corridors that would be invisible to anyone without his training. The predetermined rendezvous point was a logging road 3 miles from the highway, where Maggie waited with supplies and transportation that would allow Chuck to return to Millfield undetected. Her sedan was loaded with clothing, food, and equipment that Eddie had selected based on his knowledge of Chuck's preferences and capabilities. "How bad is it back in town?" Chuck asked as he changed into civilian clothes that would help him blend into the local population. Maggie's expression told him everything he needed to know before she spoke. "Torino's people are systematically destroying everything you helped us build. Betty lost her diner, the school's under siege again, and anyone who supported you is paying a terrible price." Chuck's jaw tightened as he absorbed the implications of his capture and the town's renewed suffering. "Then it's time to end this properly." As they drove toward Millfield through back roads that would avoid Kane's roadblocks, Chuck began planning the kind of operation that would ensure Torino's reign of terror ended permanently, without the possibility of corruption allowing it to resurrect itself months or years later. The legend was returning to finish what he'd started, and this time there would be no halfway measures. The abandoned Copper Creek mining facility squatted in the Montana wilderness like a metallic cancer, its rusted buildings and towering headframes silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Chuck lay prone on a ridge overlooking the compound, using binoculars borrowed from Eddie's extensive collection to study Torino's hastily constructed fortress with the methodical precision of someone who'd conducted similar reconnaissance missions. In far more dangerous territories, Eddie crawled up beside him, moving with the careful silence that had kept him alive through multiple combat tours. Count 12 perimeter guards, plus however many are inside the main buildings, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. Chuck adjusted the binoculars' focus, cataloging defensive positions and identifying weaknesses that inexperienced guards would inevitably create. Torino's people are street criminals, not soldiers. They're thinking like urban predators, not like people defending a fixed position. The mining compound covered roughly 10 acres, centered around the main shaft that descended into the earth. Like a concrete-lined throat, administrative buildings flanked the headframe, while equipment sheds and maintenance facilities provided multiple approaches for someone skilled in infiltration techniques. Kane's people are positioned around the administrative building, Chuck observed, noting the more professional deployment of the corrupt state police officers. They're trying to create overlapping fields of fire, but they're leaving blind spots that someone with proper training could exploit. Frank and Maggie waited in the construction truck a half-mile away, monitoring radio communications and prepared to create diversions if Chuck's infiltration was discovered. Sheriff Brennan had positioned himself to intercept any attempt by Kane's people to call for additional backup from their corrupt contacts in state government. "How are you planning to get inside?" Eddie asked, studying the compound's defenses with his own military experience. Chuck lowered the binoculars and began sketching the facility's layout in the dirt, marking guard positions and identifying the sequence of approaches that would give him the best chance of reaching Torino without alerting the entire compound. Remember the prison extraction in 71? Same principle. Avoid the obvious approaches and use their overconfidence against them. The plan that emerged from their consultation was elegantly simple. Chuck would approach from the north, where the compound's designers had assumed the steep terrain would prevent infiltration. A series of carefully timed diversions would draw guards away from critical positions, while Chuck used the facility's own infrastructure to provide concealment. "What about weapons?" Eddie asked, offering Chuck a military-style knife from his collection. "I appreciate the gesture, but I've always preferred to work with what I find," Chuck replied with a slight smile. Industrial sites like this are full of improvised weapons for someone who knows what to look for. As sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Chuck prepared for an infiltration that would either end Torino's reign of terror or result in his own death in the abandoned tunnels beneath Montana's wilderness. He'd faced similar odds before, in jungles and deserts where failure meant not just personal death, but the abandonment of people who depended on him. The mining compound's floodlights flickered to life as darkness settled over the mountains, creating harsh pools of illumination separated by deep shadows that would conceal Chuck's approach. Guard rotations occurred with the predictable regularity of people who'd never faced a determined opponent, their casual attention to security revealing why they'd chosen crime over legitimate careers. "Give me 2 hours," Chuck told Eddie as he prepared to disappear into the wilderness. "If I'm not back by then, take the others and get as far from Millfield as possible." Eddie's response carried the weight of their shared military experience. Nobody gets left behind. Chuck melted into the darkness with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned stealth from the best instructors the military could provide. Chuck's approach through the mining compound's perimeter demonstrated why legends were built on more than just martial arts tournaments and Hollywood stunts. Moving through shadows with the patience of someone who'd learned that haste meant death, he systematically neutralized Torino's outer defenses without raising a single alarm. The first guard fell to a sleeper hold applied with surgical precision. Chuck's approach so silent that the man's cigarette was still burning when he slumped unconscious against the equipment shed he'd been supposedly protecting. Chuck relieved him of his radio and weapon, adding them to the growing collection of equipment he was accumulating for the final confrontation. The compound's industrial setting provided abundant opportunities for improvised tactics. Chuck used steam pipes to mask his movement sounds, electrical panels to create temporary blackouts in specific areas, and the facility's own structural elements to provide concealment as he worked his way toward the main administrative building, where Torino waited. guard after guard discovered that their assumption about Chuck's capture had been premature. Each encounter lasted only seconds, long enough for Chuck to demonstrate why his reputation had been earned through decades of real combat rather than choreographed movie fights. None of the guards were seriously injured, but all of them would wake up with new respect for the difference between professional competence and street-level intimidation. The equipment shed yielded a treasure trove of industrial tools that Chuck's special operations training had taught him to see as weapons. Heavy wrenches became impact devices, electrical cables transformed into restraints, and welding equipment provided both offensive and defensive capabilities. Captain Kane's corrupt officers proved more challenging opponents than Torino's street thugs, their law enforcement training making them naturally suspicious of anything that seemed too easy. Chuck was forced to use more sophisticated tactics as he encountered their defensive positions, employing misdirection and environmental advantages to overcome their superior numbers and firepower. The administrative building's interior maze of offices and corridors favored Chuck's infiltration skills over the defenders' attempts to create killing fields. He moved through the structure like smoke, appearing where least expected and disappearing before organized resistance could form. Point two of Kane's officers found themselves trapped in a storage closet after Chuck used their own tactical radios to misdirect them into what they thought was a flanking maneuver. Another pair discovered that their body armor provided little protection against pressure points that could render them unconscious without visible injury. The mine's main shaft building represented the final obstacle between Chuck and his target. Torino had positioned his remaining forces in a defensive circle around the headframe, their weapons trained on the obvious approach routes, while their leader waited in the concrete structure that housed the shaft's elevator and control systems. Chuck's assault on this final position showcased every skill he'd developed through 50 years of martial arts training and military service. Using the mine's own equipment as weapons and shields, he systematically dismantled Torino's defenses with the methodical precision of someone who'd faced similar situations in environments where backup was impossible and failure meant death. The sound of combat echoed through the mining facility like gunshots in a cathedral, announcing to everyone within miles that the legend they'd thought safely imprisoned was very much free and extremely motivated to settle accounts. When the last of Torino's guards fell unconscious, Chuck stood alone in the headframe building, breathing slightly harder than normal, but otherwise unaffected by the one-sided battle he'd just concluded. Through the building's windows, he could see vehicle headlights approaching on the access road, Kane's backup arriving too late to affect the outcome. That Torino's voice echoed from deeper in the facility, shouting orders that no one was left conscious to obey. The crime boss had retreated into the mine shaft itself, apparently believing that the underground tunnels would provide refuge from an opponent who'd just proven that surface defenses were useless against his particular combination of skills and determination. Chuck checked his improvised weapons collection and began his descent into the earth, where the final confrontation would take place in conditions that favored experience over technology. The mine shaft descended into Montana's earth like a concrete throat leading to hell, its narrow walls lit by emergency lighting that cast harsh shadows between pools of industrial illumination. Chuck moved down the access ladder with careful precision, his enhanced hearing cataloging every sound that echoed from the depths below. Torino's voice bounced off the tunnel walls with the hollow desperation of someone who'd finally realized that money and corruption couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. "You think you've won something, Norris? You think this ends here?" Chuck's response echoed with quiet authority through the shaft. "It ends when you're in handcuffs, Torino. Everything else is just details." The main tunnel level opened into a complex of chambers and passageways that had been carved from the mountain's bedrock decades earlier, when copper mining had provided honest work for men who earned their living through dangerous but legitimate labor. Now the tunnels served as the final refuge for a criminal who'd built his empire on the systematic destruction of similar honest communities. Torino appeared at the far end of the main chamber, flanked by the 4 guards who'd remained loyal enough or desperate enough to follow their boss into the underground maze. Kane stood beside him, his state police uniform looking absurdly formal in the industrial setting, his service weapon trained on the tunnel entrance where Chuck would appear. "You should have stayed in your cell, old man," Kane called out. his voice carrying the brittle confidence of someone who'd never faced an opponent who couldn't be intimidated by badges and legal documents. This is where your heroic story ends. Chuck stepped into the chamber with the casual confidence of someone who'd faced far worse odds in far more dangerous places. His improvised weapons included a heavy wrench, several lengths of cable, and mining equipment that transformed the industrial setting into his personal armory. The first of Torino's guards rushed Chuck with the desperate aggression of someone fighting for his life, but found himself facing an opponent whose combat skills had been honed in environments where hesitation meant death. Chuck's defense and counterattack flowed together with the fluid precision of water finding its natural course, leaving the guard unconscious on the tunnel floor. The remaining guards attacked simultaneously, their coordination suggesting some military or law enforcement training in their backgrounds. Chuck met their assault with techniques that demonstrated why martial arts mastery required decades to achieve. Every movement economical and purposeful, every strike precisely calibrated to neutralize threats without wasting energy on unnecessary damage. Kane attempted to use his firearm to end the confrontation, but found that marksmanship training on a controlled range provided poor preparation for combat in narrow tunnels against an opponent who understood how to use terrain and movement to defeat superior firepower. His shots ricocheted harmlessly off concrete walls while Chuck closed the distance with the relentless advance of someone who'd learned tunnel fighting in the Siuchi complex. The corrupt police captain discovered that his badge meant nothing to someone who'd spent his career fighting for justice rather than personal profit. Kane's arrest techniques proved useless against Chuck's defensive skills, while his attempts at intimidation fell flat against someone who'd faced down dictators and warlords in multiple hemispheres. Sheriff Brennan's voice echoed from the tunnel entrance just as Kane attempted to shoot Chuck from behind. The honest lawman's arrival perfectly timed to prevent what would have been a cowardly murder disguised as law enforcement action. Captain Kane, you're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Torino found himself alone with Chuck in the mine's deepest chamber, his empire reduced to rubble and his protection eliminated by the same justice he'd spent years corrupting. Desperate and cornered, he reached for the explosive charges that mining operations had left behind, threatening to bring down the entire tunnel system rather than face capture. If I can't have this town, nobody can. Torino snarled, his finger hovering over the detonator that would turn their confrontation into a mutual grave. Chuck's final move demonstrated why legends endured long after the men who created them had passed into history, not through superior violence, but through the courage to risk everything for the protection of innocent people who depended on heroes to make impossible choices in impossible situations. The explosive charges that Torino threatened to detonate had been left over from the mine's operational days, their industrial-grade power sufficient to collapse several hundred feet of tunnel and entomb everyone in the underground complex. Chuck recognized the desperate calculation in the crime boss's eyes, the look of someone who'd chosen mutual destruction over facing justice for his crimes. You think you're some kind of hero, Torino sneered, his finger trembling over the detonator's trigger. But heroes die just like everyone else when the mountain comes down on their heads. Chuck's response came not through words, but through action that demonstrated 50 years of martial arts mastery compressed into a single moment of perfect timing and technique. As Torino's finger began to press the detonator, Chuck moved with speed that seemed to bend the laws of physics, his hand intercepting the device with precision that left no margin for error. The explosive charges fell harmless to the tunnel floor as Torino found himself restrained by techniques that made resistance not just futile, but physically impossible. Chuck's control was so complete that the crime boss couldn't even struggle, his body immobilized by pressure points that demonstrated the difference between movie violence and real martial arts expertise. Vincent Torino, Sheriff Brennan announced as he descended into the chamber with handcuffs and official arrest warrants. You're under arrest for extortion, conspiracy, murder, and approximately 47 other felonies that the state attorney general is very interested in discussing with you. The ascent from the mine shaft felt like emerging from a nightmare into dawn, with Chuck and the law enforcement team bringing up their prisoners through tunnels that had served as the final refuge of corruption. Captain Kane's arrest had triggered a cascade of investigations that would ultimately expose the entire network of officials who'd enabled Torino's criminal empire. By the time they reached the surface, federal vehicles were arriving to take custody of prisoners whose crimes had crossed state lines and involved corrupted law enforcement agencies. The FBI agents who processed the scene treated Chuck with the professional respect due to someone who'd just handed them the most significant organized crime bust in Montana's recent history. Word of Torino's capture and Kane's arrest spread through Millfield with the same speed that had carried news of Chuck's earlier heroics. But this time the celebration carried the weight of permanent victory rather than temporary respite. Store owners emerged from hiding. Children appeared on previously empty streets, and the town began the process of healing from 2 years of systematic oppression. Betty Patterson stood in the doorway of her diner, watching as FBI agents returned the deed to her property along with recovered funds that Torino's organization had stolen from dozens of local businesses. Her wedding ring sparkled on her finger where it belonged, returned to her by federal agents who'd recovered it from Jake Morrison's personal effects. "I can't believe it's really over," she said to Chuck as he stopped by for one final cup of coffee before continuing his interrupted journey. "It's over," Chuck confirmed, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. "This town is free to be what it was always meant to be, a place where good people can live their lives without fear." The celebration dinner at Betty's Diner that evening filled the establishment beyond capacity, with residents who'd hidden in terror now emerging to reclaim their community. Children who'd been afraid to play outside ran freely through streets that were once again safe, while their parents made plans for businesses and dreams that Torino's reign had forced them to abandon. Eddie Kowalski found Chuck preparing to leave, his weathered pickup truck loaded with the simple possessions of someone who lived life on the road. "Heading out already?" "Work's done here," Chuck replied, shaking hands with the man who'd helped make victory possible. "Besides, there are probably other towns that could use a visit from someone with time on his hands." As Chuck drove out of Millfield, his headlights illuminated a new sign at the town limits, home of the Norris Community Self-Defense Center, a place where heroes are made. In his rearview mirror, he could see the lights of houses where families were settling in for peaceful sleep, protected by the knowledge that justice had triumphed over corruption. The radio played classic country music as Chuck headed toward the horizon, already thinking about his next destination and wondering what adventures awaited around the next bend in the road. Behind him, Millfield slept peacefully under stars that shone down on a community that had rediscovered its courage and would never again allow itself to be intimidated by those who confused power with strength. Some legends, Chuck reflected as he drove through the Montana night, were worth living up to. If you liked the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.